The air on Xylos 7 was a soup of corrosive gases and metallic dust, a permanent twilight under the swirling bands of the gas giant. For 12-year-old Kale, it was the only world he had ever known. The habitat dome was a memory, a story his grandfather told before the static war had shattered it. Now, they lived in the labyrinthine tunnels carved by the planet's native silicon eaters, a honeycomb of steel and desperation. The invaders, the Kresh, had arrived a year ago. They weren't conquerors, they were hunters. They wore suits of obsidian armor that drank the light, their faces hidden behind smooth, featureless masks. They didn't kill for territory or resources, but for the intellectual thrill of the hunt. Kale had seen them take his father, a man who had fought with a ferocity that was both beautiful and terrifying. The Kresh had moved with an impossible grace, disarming him, studying him, and then ending him with a single, precise strike. They left the rest of the colony alone, a silent, waiting audience. Kale and the other children had become the new prey. They were small, quiet, and their minds were the only weapons they had. They learned the tunnels, the sounds of the shifting earth, the patterns of the Kresh's silent patrols. They were ghosts in their own home, and the hunters were growing bored. The Kresh general, Vex, observed the human colony through a sensor suite that filtered the chaotic environment into a clean, sterile data stream. To him, the colony was a failed experiment. The humans were clever, yes. They adapted, they hid, they used the environment's noise to mask their movements. But they were fundamentally predictable. They valued their own lives above all else, a primal instinct that Vex found intellectually repugnant. True strategy required the ability to sacrifice a piece for a greater gain. These humans clung to their young, their weak, their entire social structure, with a desperation that was inefficient. Vex had been hunting them for cycles, and their resistance was becoming a tedious exercise in futility. He dispatched a single hunter, a young lieutenant named Zir, to the western sector with a simple directive: flush them out. Zir moved with a predatory elegance, its armored form gliding through the tunnels. It found the scent of children, fresh and terrified. It cornered them in a dead-end shaft, a dozen small forms huddled against a bulkhead. Zir raised its arm, the tip of its energy blade glowing with a cold, violet light. It was a mercy, a quick end to a boring game. But then, one of the humans, a small girl with eyes like polished stone, stepped forward. She held a rock, a primitive gesture of defiance. Zir paused, intrigued. This was new, a willing sacrifice. Kale watched from the shadows of a ventilation shaft, his breath held tight in his chest. The girl, Alara, was the bravest and the most foolish of them all. She was stepping into the path of death, not to save herself, but to buy time for the others. It was a concept the Kresh couldn't comprehend. Zir lowered its blade, not out of mercy, but of profound curiosity. Why do you not flee? Zir's voice was a synthesized monotone, a sound that scraped against the soul. Alara just stared, her small jaw set. We don't leave anyone behind, she said, her voice trembling but clear. Zir tilted its head, a gesture that might have been confusion. It analyzed her biology, her brain chemistry, her pheromones. The data was chaotic, irrational. The concept of sacrificing one unit to save many was a logical paradox. A unit's value was in its continued function. To willingly cease function for the sake of others was a biological error. Zir decided to study this error. It deactivated its blade and gestured for her to walk with it. Alara obeyed, casting a single, desperate look back at the other children before being led away. Kale felt a cold dread settle in his gut. They had lost one, but they had given the hunters a puzzle they couldn't solve. It was a small victory, bought with the highest possible price. Vex studied the data from Zir's encounter. The human child, Alara, had not resisted capture. She had cooperated, offering information about her colony's layout, its resources, its defenses. But she had done so with a strange condition. She would only speak to the general himself. Zir reported that the humans seemed to possess a strange, almost hypnotic influence over the other children. They had watched her being taken, and instead of panicking, they had fallen into a state of quiet, focused planning. They were no longer prey, they were architects. Vex was fascinated. This was the challenge he had been seeking. He agreed to the meeting. In the vast, echoing central cavern of the Cresh's temporary base. Vex stood before the captured human child. She was small, unharmed, but her eyes held a depth of understanding that unsettled him. She did not beg or plead. She simply looked at him and said, "You can't win." Vex's internal processor's word. "Explain," he commanded. Alara smiled, a small, sad expression. "You hunt for a game. We fight to live. We have something you don't. The ability to give everything away." She began to speak, not of their weaknesses, but of a trap. A perfect, beautiful trap, designed not to kill the hunters, but to show them the limits of their own minds. The Kresh warship, the Stalker's Pride, descended from the toxic sky, a silent black dagger against the bruised clouds of Xylos. 7. Its purpose was simple: retrieve the general and his hunter, and obliterate the human colony from orbit. It was a final, elegant solution to a persistent problem. Vex, however, was intrigued. He ordered the ship to hold position. He wanted to see the trap Alara had described. He led a small contingent of hunters into the deepest, most unstable part of the tunnel network. The air grew thick with static, the ground vibrating with the planet's restless geology. Alara walked ahead, unbound, her hands clasped behind her back. She led them to a cavern where the tunnel walls were lined with crystalline formations, glowing with a soft, internal light. She pointed to a specific cluster of crystals. "The resonance frequency," she said. "It will shatter the moon's crust for 1,000 kilometers. A weapon of unimaginable power." Vex sensors analyzed the crystals. They were indeed resonant, but the energy required to trigger them was astronomical. A single Kresh warship could not generate it. "A bluff," one of his hunters reported. Vex hesitated, but Alara's certainty was absolute. She spoke of the children, of their plan, of their willingness to stay and trigger the device themselves. It was the ultimate sacrifice. Vex, in his pursuit of the ultimate intellectual challenge, made a miscalculation. He ordered the Stalker's Pride to fire its primary weapon into the crystals, not to destroy them, but to test their capacity. A beam of coherent energy lanced down from the sky, striking the cavern. The crystals did not shatter. They absorbed the energy, glowing brighter, humming with a power that dwarfed the Kresh's weapon. And then, they all pulsed in unison. A wave of pure, concussive force erupted from the cavern, traveling through the rock and metal with the speed of sound. It was not a targeted weapon. It was a release of pent-up planetary stress, amplified 1,000-fold. The Stalker's Pride was caught in the blast wave, its shields flickering for a microsecond before being torn apart. The warship and the hunters within it were annihilated. On the surface, Kale and the remaining children emerged from their shelters as the ground trembled violently. They had not won with a weapon, but with an idea. A lesson the hunters could never learn: that the most powerful force in the universe is not intellect, but the love that makes one willing to be nothing for the sake of everything.